Maggie Calloway stood 3 feet from the door, her hand pressed against her mouth so tightly she could feel her own pulse against her palm. The hallway was dark, the kind of dark that makes every sound feel closer than it is. And through the narrow crack in the door, she heard the voices of the people who were supposed to love her most, calmly deciding how they would erase her from her father's will without her ever finding out. She did not move. She did not breathe. She stood there in the quiet of her childhood home, listening to her own family plan to take away everything her father had spent his life building for her. And in that single moment, something inside her changed forever. She had spent years being the one who showed up, the one who drove her father to his appointments, the one who sat with him through the long nights when his memory started to slip, while the rest of them called only when they needed something. And now, standing in that hallway, she understood that all of it, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, had been quietly written out of the story they were telling each other in the next room. She wanted to open that door and scream at them, to demand they look her in the eye and say it to her face, but something told her that if she did, they would simply cover their tracks and she would lose the one thing she still had: the truth. So she stepped back into the shadows and she made a decision that would change everything that came after. Months later, in a courtroom she never imagined she would set foot in, Maggie sat perfectly still while a lawyer slid a folder across the table toward a judge who had no idea what was about to unfold. Her face showed nothing. No anger, no fear, only a calm that unsettled everyone in that room who thought they already knew how this story would end. What she did in the months between that hallway and that courtroom is something almost no one saw coming. Not her brother, not her sister, not even the woman who thought she had already won. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Maggie ended up in that hallway, listening to a conversation that would define the rest of her life, you have to go back to who these people were before any of this started, because none of them began as villains, at least not in their own eyes. Every one of them believed they were owed something, and every one of them had a reason they told themselves at night to justify what they were about to do. This is a story about a family that looked, from the outside, like any other, and about the quiet, calculated choice one woman made when she realized the people closest to her were willing to erase her completely. Harold Calloway built his life from almost nothing. He grew up in a small house outside Cleveland, the son of a factory worker who worked double shifts most of his life and never once complained about it in front of his children. Harold learned early that nothing in life would be handed to him, and by the time he was 22, he had already worked 3 different jobs at once, saving every extra dollar toward a plan he had barely spoken aloud to anyone. By the time he was 40, he had turned a small hardware supply business into a company worth more than anyone in his family had ever imagined possible. He was proud, stubborn, and generous in ways that were sometimes hard to see unless you knew him well. The kind of man who would quietly pay off a struggling employee's medical bill without ever mentioning it to another soul. He married young, to a woman named Eleanor, and together they had 2 children before Eleanor became sick with an illness that took her far too soon. Harold never fully spoke about how those years affected him, but those closest to him noticed that he became more guarded afterward, more careful about who he let close. Years later, at a charity dinner he had almost decided not to attend, he met a woman named Vivian, poised, attentive, and quick to laugh at his jokes in a way that reminded him, at least for a little while, of what it felt like to not be alone. They married within 2 years, and for a long time, it seemed like a genuinely good decision, one that gave Harold companionship in a chapter of his life that might otherwise have been very lonely. Maggie was Harold's middle child, though for most of her life she felt like the only one who truly stayed close to him. She had studied nursing in her 20s, drawn to the work because she liked the feeling of being useful to people during their hardest moments, and she spent nearly 15 years working in a hospital before eventually stepping back from her career to help care for her father as his health began to decline. She moved into a small guest house on his property, not because she expected anything in return, but because she could not imagine being anywhere else while he needed her. She managed his medications, drove him to appointments across 3 different specialists, and learned to recognize the small signs, the pauses in his speech, the moments of confusion about the day of the week, long before anyone else in the family seemed to notice or want to notice them. Her older half-brother, Richard, had a very different relationship with Harold. Richard was Harold's son from an earlier relationship before Eleanor, and he had grown up feeling, rightly or wrongly, like he was always trying to prove something to a father who was rarely around during his childhood. Richard was charming in the way that made people trust him almost immediately, quick with a joke, generous with compliments, and always dressed like someone whose business was doing better than it actually was. In reality, Richard had spent nearly 2 decades running a series of ventures that never quite succeeded the way he described them to others. And he had grown accustomed, quietly and without ever calling it what it was, to Harold covering the gap between his lifestyle and his actual income whenever things became difficult. Diane, the youngest of Harold's children, had always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who smoothed over tension at holiday gatherings and avoided conflict at almost any cost. She had married young, moved several states away to build a life with her husband, and stayed just distant enough from the daily reality of their father's decline that she could tell herself, most of the time, that things were not as serious as Maggie occasionally described over the phone. Diane loved her father deeply. That was never in question. But she had also spent much of her adult life leaning on Vivian for approval and guidance. A dynamic that had started innocently enough when Diane was still a teenager adjusting to a new stepmother, but had grown, over the years, into something closer to quiet dependence. Vivian herself was polished, careful, and always deeply aware of how she was perceived by others, whether at a dinner party or within her own family. She had built a comfortable, secure life as Harold's wife, one that included a level of social standing and financial security she had not experienced earlier in her life. As Harold's health began to worsen, something in Vivian began to shift, quietly and privately, as she started to think about what her comfortable life would look like once he was gone, and whether the current structure of his estate truly protected the position she had spent years building for herself within this family. Over the following weeks, Maggie began paying closer attention to details she had previously let pass without much thought. She noticed that Vivian had started scheduling appointments for Harold with a new attorney, someone Maggie had never once heard mentioned in the years she had been managing her father's care. And these appointments always seemed to fall on days when Maggie herself had other obligations that kept her away from the house. She noticed that certain financial documents, which used to sit openly on Harold's desk the way they always had started disappearing into a locked drawer inside Vivian's private office down the hall. She noticed that Richard had begun visiting far more often than usual, always arriving with some practical-sounding reason, and always finding a way to spend long stretches of time alone with Harold discussing the business, even though Harold's ability to fully track complex financial conversations had clearly declined over the past year. Rather than raise any alarms or ask questions that might tip off her family that she suspected something, Maggie began quietly documenting everything she observed in a private notebook she kept hidden in a place none of them would ever think to search. She recorded dates, brief notes on conversations she happened to overhear, and small details that seemed insignificant entirely on their own, but which were slowly beginning to form a clear and troubling pattern once placed side by side.
She started making careful copies of documents whenever she had a legitimate reason to be near her father's desk, always careful never to take anything that would reveal she had been looking through things that were not technically hers to examine. She paid especially close attention to Diane during this period, sensing that her younger sister's brief hesitation in that overheard study conversation might mean she was not fully committed to whatever Richard and Vivian were planning together. Maggie began looking for small, careful ways to keep an open line of communication with Diane, calling more often than she used to, asking gentle questions about how Diane felt their father seemed during her last visit, all without ever revealing what she herself already knew. It was a delicate balance, staying close enough to notice any shift in Diane's thinking, without ever risking that Diane might accidentally mention these conversations to Vivian. It was during this early period that Maggie finally reached out to Nathan Cole, an estate attorney who had worked with her father many years earlier, long before Vivian had introduced her own preferred lawyer into the family's financial affairs. Maggie framed her initial questions carefully, almost casually, asking general things about elder law, about how estate documents could theoretically be challenged after the fact, and about what kind of evidence would actually matter in court if a family member ever came to suspect undue influence over an aging parent. Nathan, who had known and respected Harold for decades, sensed almost immediately that Maggie was not simply asking out of idle curiosity, and he gently encouraged her to tell him what was really going on. Slowly, over the course of several careful conversations spread across a couple of weeks, Maggie told Nathan everything, starting with what she had overheard that night outside the study door, and continuing through every small, troubling detail she had noticed since. Nathan listened without interrupting, taking careful notes of his own, and by the end of their third conversation, he agreed to help her, quietly and discreetly, without alerting anyone else in the family that he was now involved in the situation at all. Nathan explained to Maggie, in plain and direct terms, that suspicion alone would never be enough to protect her father or to eventually expose what was happening. If she genuinely wanted to challenge whatever new estate documents Vivian and Richard were preparing, she would need clear, well-documented proof that Harold's decision-making had been influenced in ways that did not reflect his authentic wishes, formed before his health began to decline. He suggested she also consider bringing in a forensic accountant, someone experienced in tracing the movement of money across accounts over time, to determine whether anything had already been quietly redirected out of Harold's finances before any new will was ever formally signed. Maggie agreed without hesitation, and within a week, Nathan introduced her to Priya Anand, a sharp and meticulous forensic accountant who had helped several families navigate similar situations in the past, and who began working with Maggie under strict, complete confidence. As the weeks slowly turned into months, Maggie continued playing the role her family had come to expect of her, pleasant at dinners, quietly supportive during conversations, careful never to ask any question that might suggest she suspected something larger was happening beneath the surface. She even allowed herself, on one occasion, to appear slightly distracted during a family gathering, mentioning casually that she had been thinking about eventually moving closer to an old friend out of state, once her father no longer needed quite as much daily care. It was a small, calculated comment, one she knew would help ease whatever lingering concern Richard and Vivian might have about her paying too much attention to their plans going forward. Behind that calm and unremarkable exterior, however, Priya was steadily uncovering a troubling and consistent pattern. Money had begun moving out of Harold's primary business account and into a newly opened account connected directly to Richard, in amounts small enough at first to avoid drawing much attention, but consistent enough over time to represent a significant total sum. Priya discovered that these transfers had begun almost immediately following the night of that fateful birthday dinner, suggesting that whatever conversation Maggie had overheard in the study had not simply been idle talk, but the early stages of a plan already being set into motion. There was a tense moment nearly 2 months into this quiet, careful investigation, when Maggie very nearly lost her resolve entirely. She had walked into Vivian's office late one evening, searching for a signed permission form needed for one of Harold's upcoming doctor's appointments, and found Vivian and Richard sitting closely together at the desk, reviewing what appeared to be an early draft of an updated estate document spread out between them. Maggie caught only a brief glimpse of the paperwork before Vivian quickly and smoothly closed the folder. But what she saw in that instant was enough to confirm that this was no longer simply a private conversation behind a closed door. It had become something concrete, something with actual dates, actual language, and actual signatures already being carefully planned. Maggie forced herself to remain outwardly calm, apologizing quickly for the interruption before excusing herself from the room without asking a single question that might reveal what she had noticed. It was not until she reached her car parked outside that her hands finally began to shake, the full weight of what she had just seen settling over her all at once. She sat there for several long minutes before she felt steady enough to drive. That same week, almost as if sensing the shift in the air within the family, Diane called Maggie unexpectedly one evening, her voice tight with something that sounded very close to guilt. She did not say outright what exactly was troubling her, but she asked Maggie several careful, probing questions, whether their father truly seemed to be making his own decisions lately, or whether Diane should be more worried than she had allowed herself to be, about how easily he seemed to go along with whatever the people closest to him suggested. Maggie listened closely, to every word, choosing her own responses with great care, gently encouraging Diane to trust the instincts she was clearly already having, rather than continuing to dismiss them out of a desire to avoid conflict. It was a short conversation, but it planted something important in Diane, a small but growing seed of doubt about the role she had allowed herself to play in everything unfolding around her. Meanwhile, Priya's findings continued to grow more serious and more clearly damaging with each passing week. She discovered that a significant sum of money had been transferred out of one of Harold's core business accounts and into the new account under Richard's name, structured in a way that appeared deliberately designed to avoid drawing outside attention. Broken into smaller transfers spread carefully across several months. She also uncovered evidence that Vivian had been quietly in contact with her preferred attorney for several months prior to that birthday dinner, meaning the underlying plan to eventually change Harold's estate had almost certainly been in motion long before that overheard conversation in the study had ever taken place at all. Nathan, reviewing these growing findings alongside Maggie during one of their private meetings, explained carefully that this consistent pattern of financial movement, combined with clear medical evidence of Harold's cognitive decline during the very same period, could form the strong foundation of a serious legal challenge should the family ever attempt to formally finalize the new estate documents they were preparing. He cautioned Maggie, however, that timing would matter a great deal, and that they needed to be fully prepared to act the moment any formal signing was scheduled, rather than risk waiting until it was already too late to intervene. The turning point arrived sooner than any of them had anticipated. Vivian, growing visibly more impatient, and perhaps sensing that time was genuinely limited, given Harold's continued decline, scheduled a formal signing of the updated estate documents, deliberately inviting only Richard and a notary of her own personal choosing, while carefully excluding both Maggie and Diane from any part of the arrangements. Maggie learned of the exact scheduled date almost entirely by accident, overhearing Vivian confirming the appointment over the phone from the next room, while Maggie sat quietly pretending to read a magazine nearby. The moment Vivian left the room, Maggie immediately contacted Nathan, who told her, in no uncertain terms, that if they intended to act, it needed to happen before that signing took place, not after, because once new documents were formally executed and notarized, undoing them afterward would become significantly more difficult, even with strong supporting evidence already in hand. On the morning of the scheduled signing, Maggie arrived at her father's house earlier than usual, carrying with her a carefully organized folder that Nathan had helped her prepare over the previous several days. Inside were Priya's detailed financial findings, copies of the various documents Maggie had quietly gathered over the preceding months, and a formal request for an emergency evaluation of Harold's current capacity to make significant legal decisions, something Nathan had discreetly arranged through a court-appointed evaluator in the days leading up to that morning. Vivian, Richard, and the notary were already gathered together inside the study when Maggie walked through the front door, and for the first time in many months, she did not stay quiet or hold herself back. She asked, calmly but firmly, for everyone in the room to stop what they were doing, explaining clearly that she had strong reason to believe her father was not currently in a position to fully understand what he was being asked to sign, and that an independent evaluation needed to take place before anything moved forward any further. The reaction inside that study was immediate and sharp. Richard's usually calm and easygoing demeanor cracked instantly into open frustration, accusing Maggie directly of interfering purely out of jealousy, insisting she had never supported this family the way she liked to claim she had. Vivian, more visibly composed but clearly unsettled beneath the surface, insisted firmly that everything being done that morning was entirely proper and that Maggie had absolutely no right to question decisions that were not hers to make in the first place. It was Diane, standing quietly near the doorway of the study, who finally found her voice in that tense moment. She told the room, her own voice trembling slightly as she spoke, that she had suspected for weeks now that something about this entire process felt wrong, and that she fully supported Maggie's request for an independent evaluation, regardless of what that decision might ultimately mean for the rest of them. She did not take the words back, even as Vivian turned to look at her with obvious disbelief. The signing was postponed that morning, and in the difficult weeks that followed, the independent evaluation Nathan had arranged confirmed exactly what Maggie had feared for so long, that Harold's cognitive decline was significant enough to raise serious, well-documented concerns about his ability to fully understand and freely consent to major legal changes, particularly changes that had been introduced and pushed forward without complete transparency or his own family's full knowledge. Armed with this formal evaluation, along with Priya's detailed and thoroughly documented financial records, and the collection of supporting documentation Maggie had carefully gathered over the previous several months, Nathan filed a formal legal challenge, not only to prevent the newly drafted will from ever being executed, but to formally address the significant funds that had already been quietly moved out of Harold's accounts and into Richard's over the preceding months. The legal process that followed proved slower and more painful than Maggie had originally expected, stretching across several genuinely difficult months. Richard hired an attorney of his own and continued to insist, both privately and through his legal representation, that everything he had done had been entirely within his rights as Harold's son, framing Maggie's actions publicly as an attempt to seize control over the family's finances purely out of long-standing resentment rather than any genuine concern for their father's well-being. Vivian largely withdrew from making any public statements of her own, instead allowing her legal team to argue on her behalf that she had simply been assisting her husband with matters he himself had personally asked her to help manage during a difficult period in his health. It was during a formal hearing, held many months after that tense and pivotal morning in the study, that the full picture finally came together clearly in front of a judge. Priya presented her extensive financial findings in careful, methodical detail, walking the court step by step through every transfer, every date, and every discrepancy she had uncovered over the course of her investigation. Nathan walked the court through the full timeline that he and Maggie had carefully constructed together, piece by piece, over many long months of quiet, careful work. The judge's ruling, when it finally arrived, invalidated the attempted changes to Harold's estate plan entirely, citing clear and compelling evidence of both diminished capacity and undue influence surrounding the entire process. The court also formally ordered a complete accounting of the funds Priya had successfully traced into Richard's personal accounts, with clear instructions for full restitution to be made back to Harold's estate as soon as possible. For Impudur, Richard. This ruling meant not only serious financial consequences, but the very public unraveling of a carefully maintained version of himself that he had spent years cultivating in front of family and friends alike. That of a devoted and loyal son simply trying his best to help manage his aging father's complicated affairs. For Vivian, the ruling meant the quiet but undeniable erosion of the secure position she had worked so hard and so carefully to build for herself within this family over many years. Even those within her own social circle, people who had once trusted her completely and without question, slowly began to view her quite differently in light of everything that had come out publicly during the formal hearing. Invitations to social gatherings grew noticeably less frequent. Old friends found reasons to keep their distance. For Maggie herself, the ruling did not feel like the triumphant, satisfying victory she might have imagined months earlier, back when she first stood frozen and silent outside that study door on the night of her father's birthday. It felt instead like a heavy, deeply complicated sense of relief, the kind that only comes after successfully protecting something truly important, but at a personal cost that could never be fully undone or reversed. Her relationship with Richard, already strained for many years before any of this began, became almost entirely unrecognizable in the aftermath, reduced now to only occasional and distant contact that carried very little remaining warmth between them. Her relationship with Vivian ended almost completely, the two of them exchanging only the bare minimum communication required by the ongoing practical management of Harold's continuing care. It was Diane, somewhat surprisingly to everyone including herself, who emerged from this entire difficult situation closer to Maggie than she had been in many years. In the months following the conclusion of the hearing, Diane began spending significantly more time at their father's house, gradually taking on caregiving responsibilities she had long avoided out of distance and discomfort, and speaking openly and honestly with Maggie about the genuine guilt she carried for having gone along, even quietly, with Vivian's plans for as long as she ultimately did. The two sisters, who had slowly drifted apart over years shaped by very different choices and very different distances, began the difficult but meaningful work of rebuilding something honest between them, built not on the comfortable silence of avoiding hard truths, the way they once had, but on the harder, more valuable work of acknowledging those truths directly and openly with one another. Harold himself, in the time he ultimately had left, was never given the full and complete weight of every difficult detail from the legal proceedings that had unfolded around him. Both Maggie and Nathan agreed, after careful discussion, that sharing every painful detail would serve no meaningful purpose beyond causing him unnecessary distress during a period when his health continued its slow decline. What Harold did understand clearly, during the moments of genuine clarity that still occasionally came to him, was that Maggie had protected him fiercely, that she had done so quietly and without ever once seeking recognition or thanks for it, and that whatever complicated and painful feelings now existed elsewhere within the family, her loyalty to him personally had never once wavered throughout the entire ordeal. In one of their final, truly clear conversations together, Harold told Maggie, his voice steady despite everything, that he had always known deep down she was the one who would take care of things properly, even if he had never quite said it clearly enough while he still had the chance to. Looking back now on everything that happened over those difficult months, Maggie has said that the hardest part was never really the legal process itself, and not even the tense confrontation inside that study on the morning of the scheduled signing. The hardest part was standing frozen outside that door on the night of her father's 81st birthday, listening to people she loved deeply decide, so easily and so casually, that she did not matter enough to even be told the truth about what they were planning. What she ultimately chose to do afterward was never born out of simple anger or any deep desire for personal revenge, but instead out of a quiet, steady determination to ensure that the full truth would eventually come to light, no matter how long that process took, and no matter what it might personally cost her along the way. This story raises questions that reach far beyond just one family and one contested inheritance. It asks what we truly owe to the people who show up quietly, year after year, without ever asking for recognition or thanks in return. It asks how easily people can convince themselves that someone else's years of quiet sacrifice do not deserve real acknowledgement, simply because acknowledging it honestly would be inconvenient or costly to their own plans. And it asks, perhaps most importantly, what any of us might actually do if we ever found ourselves standing in a dark hallway of our own, listening to the people closest to us decide, calmly and without hesitation, that we were merely an obstacle standing between them and what they truly wanted. What do you think you would have done in Maggie's position? Confront them directly in that very moment, or quietly play the long game the way she ultimately chose to? Let us know. In the comments below, we always genuinely love hearing how each of you might have handled a situation like this differently. And if this